Hello again. Today's Things to Think About is based on episode 4 of the Investigating Jesus series, The Parable of the Sheep and the Goats. I'm going to begin by explaining the word parable in case anyone is not familiar with it. A parable is a story, but it is special in that it is a story that is used to teach a lesson or make a point. Jesus was a wonderful storyteller, and he told many parables. He did this for several reasons, I think. For one thing, he had many things that he wanted to teach his followers, and he knew that some of his teachings would upset the religious leaders of the time. In fact, the Pharisees were just waiting for Jesus to say something they could use against him so that they could have him put in prison. By putting his teachings in the form of a story, it was less likely that they could bring a case against him, as stories can be interpreted in different ways. Another reason Jesus told parables is that he wanted his listeners to think deeply about what he was saying and discover for themselves the message behind his words. Storytelling was not a new idea. By the time Jesus lived and preached, there was a long tradition of storytelling in Jewish culture. I think most of us would agree that stories are generally more interesting to listen to than just long lists of do this and don't do that. So rather than, for example, just saying, you should help someone who is wounded and lying in a ditch, Jesus told a parable of the Good Samaritan. The neat thing about parables, too, is that we tend to remember stories better than instructions. So at the beginning of this story, when Jesus starts talking about sheep and goats, some people in the crowd would already have been wondering who the sheep and goats represented. Jesus said that at judgment time, people would be separated just as a shepherd separates goats and sheep. The sheep would be in the place of honor to the right of the shepherd, and the goats would be put on the left. We are told later on in the parable that only the sheep or the people on the right are allowed into the kingdom of heaven. If you haven't read the whole parable or heard it read during the service, you may want to pause the video and do that now, as I'm going to be reading only a few verses during this video. The full story is from the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. I will be reading verses 34 to 40 right now. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." In this last verse, Jesus used the phrase, "the least of these brothers of mine." Notice that the king in the story called the poor, the powerless, the sick, and the imprisoned his brothers and sisters. Those are strong words, because when you think about it, the brothers and sisters of a king would be princes and princesses. As he often did, Jesus turned people's ideas and prejudices upside down by insisting that instead of being looked down upon, the least in society should be treated as royalty. Now, it's time for a riddle. I'd like you to try to guess the name of a famous person who spent her entire life living the way Jesus described in this parable. She fed the hungry, gave water to the thirsty, gave clothes to the needy, nursed the sick, and visited those in prison. A few more clues. She was a Roman Catholic nun from Europe, and she spent most of her life helping out the desperately poor in India. She never asked for any rewards, money, or fame for her work, but people did recognize how special she was, and in 1979 she received the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, if you haven't guessed the name already, don't worry about it. This lady lived quite a while ago and died in 1997. But I think if you share some of these clues with your parents, there's a good chance they will be able to guess the riddle. The lady's name is Mother Teresa. At some point, you may be interested in doing a little research on the very interesting life of this remarkable person. Often when people hear the phrase, "I was hungry and you fed me, thirsty and you gave me a drink," and so on, it will be Mother Teresa that people think of. Her story is an example of how one person can make a difference in the lives of others. She said that she always saw the face of Christ in the faces of the people she helped, and she offered these words of advice. If you can't feed 100 people, then feed just one. I hope this has given you something to think about today. Next Sunday, we begin looking forward to the Christmas season. So we are going to be listening in as Lion and Turtle talk about Advent. See you then.